The Winter Palace, seat of imperial power, was quiet that cold November morning in 1796. Its tall, gilded walls, polished marble floors, and crystal chandeliers had seen triumphs and betrayals alike. Coronations had taken place here. Coups had erupted here. Executions had been carried out here. But nothing could have prepared it for what was about to happen inside its private chambers. Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, the most powerful woman in Europe, was about to take her last breath, and she would do so not with grace, not with ceremony, but in sudden, shocking silence. Earlier that morning, Catherine had been walking through a small private bathroom, the walls cold with marble, the room sparsely lit by a single candle. One moment she was upright, her mind perhaps wandering through thoughts of the empire she had built, the victories she had won, the city she had transformed. The next, her body simply gave way. She collapsed onto the cold floor, and there was no sound, not even a whisper. The palace instantly became alive with panic. Servants ran toward the sound of her fall, their footsteps echoing through the corridors. The usual order, the careful rhythm of the court, broke into chaos. Footmen shouted her name, guards rushed to the chamber, physicians hurried, their robes swishing over the marble floors. The air smelled faintly of burning candles and wax as the palace trembled under the storm of movement. Catherine was lifted from the floor, her body heavy and lifeless in the arms of those who had served her for decades. They carried her through the gilded corridors she had walked countless times as a ruler who commanded empires, armies, and courts. But now she was just a fragile human, slipping from the world she had shaped. Her massive bed awaited her, the velvet canopy above like a dark red sky pressing down upon her. She was laid down gently, her white hair spilling across the pillow. Her breaths came shallow, uneven, trembling with the quiet rhythm of a fading life. Around her, the court physicians moved like ghosts, their faces drawn and pale. They spoke in whispers to each other, careful not to startle her. They already understood. Catherine II, who had ruled Russia for 34 years, who had turned St. Petersburg into a hub of ideas, art, and culture, who had expanded the empire's borders, who had crushed rebellions and outmaneuvered kings, was dying. The body that had endured decades of political storms, betrayal, heartbreak, and conquest was finally surrendering. Outside her chamber, the palace reacted differently. Guards who had once followed her commands without question now murmured nervously. Courtiers whispered in corners, speculating, guessing, trying to anticipate the next move in a game they had long thought they understood. The servants, who had polished her boots and prepared her dresses, now wondered quietly if history itself had faltered. By mid-morning, Catherine's breaths had slowed further. The candles flickered as if bowing to the stillness in the room. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Every second stretched longer than the last. Outside, the city of St. Petersburg stirred under a layer of frost, unaware that the most remarkable ruler it had ever known was leaving the world. Then it happened. Her last breath came like a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of an entire empire. One moment there was life, the next there was none. The room fell into an uneasy silence. The physicians, once bustling with urgency, now stepped back. Her body, once so full of energy and command, was now cold, still, and final. But even in death, Catherine's presence could not be contained. The very walls seemed to hold their breath. and almost immediately whispers began to spread, not about her achievements, not about her reforms, her brilliant strategies, or her cultural advancements, but about something far more grotesque. Servants murmured to each other. Was it truly natural? A young guard asked nervously, could there have been something else? And the rumor started to creep, first softly, then louder. The truth of Catherine's death was simple, a stroke. It was ordinary, documented, witnessed by doctors, and yet truth rarely survives long in a palace filled with ambition, jealousy, and fear. Almost immediately, the story began to mutate. It became easier for people to believe the scandal than the simple facts. The whispers, the half-heard phrases, the imaginative minds of courtiers began to weave a story that was grotesque, impossible, unforgettable, a story that would outlive the Empress herself. The palace itself became a theater of tension. Everyone who had once bowed to her now moved with fear and hesitation. Nobody dared to speak of her brilliance. Nobody dared to reflect on her years of careful preparation, her victories, her reforms. All they could talk about was the possibility that her death might not have been ordinary. And yet, Catherine's legacy was far stronger than rumor could ever hope to touch. In life, she had transformed Russia. She had rebuilt St. Petersburg, invited thinkers, artists, and philosophers from across Europe. She had expanded the empire's borders, defeated enemies, and brought Russia into the eyes of the world as a power to be reckoned with. She had mastered the art of survival in a hostile court, turning humiliation into strength, insult into strategy, and betrayal into opportunity. From the very moment she arrived in Russia as Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst, a young German princess, she understood that power required patience, intelligence, and relentless will. She learned the Russian language, studied history and philosophy, built alliances quietly, and waited. And when the time came, she seized the throne from husband Peter III with precision and courage that would echo through history. Her reign was marked not just by expansion and war, but by intellect and culture. She corresponded with the greatest minds of Europe, debated philosophy, and transformed Russia's court into a place where ideas flowed freely. Yet she was also a ruler of iron, crushing rebellions and ensuring that her power remained unchallenged. But in those final moments, none of that mattered to the whisperers. The moment she died, a new legend began to form, one that would overshadow her accomplishments for generations. It was a lie crafted not by chance, but by envy, by fear, by the inability of a world to accept a woman so powerful and so unstoppable. This lie would travel far, mutate, and grow. It would reduce Catherine the Great, who had commanded armies, negotiated treaties, expanded an empire, and dazzled the world with intellect, into a grotesque figure of rumor and shame. But for now, in the quiet of the Winter Palace, only her still body remained, and in the silence, the truth waited, fragile and unnoticed, while the world outside began to whisper a story that was not hers. The Empress was dead, but history and the scandal that would define her memory was only beginning. Sophia Augusta Frederica was born far from the glittering courts of Europe's great empires. A German princess, she grew up in a world of small castles, narrow streets, and polite, careful routines. Her family had influence, but it was minor, easily overlooked by the great powers of the time. She was not born to rule empires, nor to change the world. Yet, from the first, something in her mind and spirit set her apart. Quiet determination, curiosity, intelligence that was far too large for the small rooms in which she played as a child. At the age of 14, the winds of fate began to sweep her across Europe. She was chosen as a bride for Peter, the heir to the Russian throne. To many, it was a simple strategic marriage, a union meant to strengthen alliances. To Sophia, it was everything. It was her chance to escape obscurity and live a life that mattered. But Russia would not wait for her comfort. Russia demanded adaptation, obedience, and resilience. "The country will not adapt to you," her father told her before she left. "You must adapt to Russia." The journey to St. Petersburg was long and cold. She traveled across frozen lands, over snowy plains, through winds that seemed to cut through bone. The young girl who had been Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst arrived at a palace that was beautiful, intimidating, and frighteningly unfamiliar. The court was a web of intrigue, whispers, and silent threats. Courtiers watched her every move, ready to pounce on mistakes, ridicule missteps, or humiliate her in front of others. From the first day, she understood that survival required more than obedience. It required transformation. The marriage ceremony to Peter was grand, staged with pomp and ritual meant to symbolize unity and stability. But behind the spectacle lay a growing reality. Peter was not a husband a woman could rely on. He was young, erratic, and emotionally stunted. He spent more time playing with toy soldiers than engaging with his empire or his bride. He openly insulted Catherine, humiliating her before the court. He paraded his mistresses, daring her to challenge him. For years their marriage remained inconsummated, a wound to her dignity, and a lesson in patience, endurance, and cunning. Each insult, each act of public shame forced Catherine inward. Each night spent beside a husband who despised her strengthened a resolve she did not yet fully understand. If she was to survive in Russia, she would have to learn its language, its customs, and its dangerous games of power. She would have to build alliances carefully, secretly, and without drawing attention. She would have to become more than a princess, more than a wife. She would have to become a strategist, a player, a force capable of shaping a nation. Catherine began by learning Russian. At first it was clumsy and awkward. She stumbled over words, mispronounced letters, and was teased by some nobles for her foreign accent. But she persisted, practicing daily, consuming every book she could find. She read history, philosophy, and politics, studying the rise and fall of empires, the strategies of kings, the ambitions of rulers, and the mistakes that led them to ruin. She wrote letters to thinkers across Europe, debating their ideas and refining her own understanding of governance and power. Her education was not just academic. She studied the court itself, the alliances, the rivalries, the habits of those around her. She noticed Peter's weaknesses, his unpredictable temper, and the ways he alienated those who might have supported him. She noted the fears and ambitions of the nobles. She began to understand the invisible lines of power, the threads that, if pulled correctly, could change the course of the empire. During this time, she also learned patience. Patience was survival. Patience was strategy. She endured public humiliation without complaint, internalizing it and turning it into fuel for her eventual rise. Every insult, each slight, sharpened her intellect, strengthened her will, and deepened her understanding of the human heart. Catherine's private thoughts often turned toward ambition, not for vanity, but for necessity. She realized that to remain alive respected, and safe in a foreign land, she had to grow stronger than the men around her. She had to command, manipulate, and persuade. She had to build a foundation of influence that would support her if and when the moment came to seize power. Her personal transformation was mirrored by a public one. She began to carry herself differently, slowly shedding the timid, unsure demeanor of a foreign teenager. She learned to dress, speak, and act in ways that signaled authority, intelligence, and dignity. She surrounded herself with allies quietly, men and women who recognized her brilliance and were willing to lend loyalty in return for her protection or favor. The years passed, and the young girl from Germany became Catherine, a woman of intellect, grace, and emerging power. She understood the limitations imposed upon her as a woman in a male-dominated court, and chose to turn those limitations into a hidden weapon. While Peter remained reckless, self-indulgent, and careless, Catherine's careful patience became her secret strength. She began to see the cracks in Peter's rule. His policies angered the church, offended the army, and alienated the nobility. Each of his failures became her opportunity. She quietly observed, noting who could be swayed, who could be trusted, and who would falter under pressure. For 17 years, she prepared herself. Every moment of endurance, every act of discretion, every hidden alliance was a step toward a throne she intended to claim. And then came the moment that would define her destiny. Peter III's poor judgment, arrogance, and cruelty opened a door that Catherine had spent nearly 2 decades building toward. When the opportunity arose, she acted decisively. Supported by loyal guards and strategic allies, including men who had shared both her bed and her ambition, she seized the throne at the age of 33. But before she could rule, before she could expand her empire, before she could change the face of Russia, Catherine had to survive this dangerous court. She had to be clever, patient, and strong. Her years as Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst had taught her every lesson she would need. She had learned to endure, to plan, and to transform. She had become not just an empress in title, but a ruler in mind, spirit, and will. Catherine's transformation was complete. The girl from Germany had disappeared, replaced by a woman who understood that intelligence, patience, and strategy were as powerful as armies. The whispers of the court, the sneers, and the humiliations had all served a purpose. They had forged her into someone capable of seizing one of the greatest empires in the world. And as she stood on the edge of her destiny, preparing to step into power that few women had ever held, one truth became clear. Survival was not enough. She would not simply rule, she would dominate. She would outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast every enemy. And she would do it in a world that expected her to fail simply because she was a woman. Catherine's rise from Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst to Empress of Russia was not a story of chance. It was a story of intellect, courage, and an unbreakable will. And it was only the beginning.
The moment Catherine took the throne, the Winter Palace seemed to shift under her command. The grandeur of its gilded walls, the echoing corridors, the towering ceilings, all were hers now. And yet she knew that power was never given. It was taken, held, and defended. For decades she had endured humiliation, whispered insults, and the arrogance of a husband who could not see the force growing beside him. Now she was Empress of all Russia, and she intended to show the world exactly what that meant. Peter III had been weak, careless, and cruel. His brief reign had alienated the church, enraged the military, and insulted the nobility. But Catherine understood the real danger. The empire was enormous, fragile, and filled with people who could turn their loyalty with a single whisper. To rule Russia, she needed more than authority. She needed imagination, strategy, and the ability to see the empire not as it was, but as it could be under her command. The first act of her reign was to assert her presence. She did not delay. She did not send messages to explain her authority. She ruled immediately, decisively, as if every day before had been practice for this very moment. Courtiers, soldiers, and foreign diplomats watched her closely. Some were impressed, some terrified, but all knew she was not a ruler to be taken lightly. Catherine began with the court itself. Gone were the stifling rituals and rigid ceremonies that had made the palace a place of fear rather than influence. In their place, she invited scholars, architects, philosophers, and scientists from across Europe. St. Petersburg, a city of stone and politics, started to glow with ideas. She read their works, debated their theories, and allowed her court to become a place where intellect and strategy were as valued as birth and rank. Her correspondence with thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot became legendary. She didn't simply write to them. She challenged them, questioned them, and absorbed their ideas into the vision she had for Russia. These men, who were considered the sharpest minds in Europe, recognized her brilliance. In Paris, Voltaire called her the Northern Star, defending her reputation as an enlightened monarch, even as rumors began to stir in the shadows. But culture and intellect were only one side of her power. Catherine knew that an empire of ice and blood required strength. Borders were long, cities were far apart, and enemies were never far away. She moved her armies like a storm across the frontiers. The Ottoman Empire, once a formidable neighbor, fell before her strategy and her generals. By 1783, Crimea was under Russian control, opening the Black Sea to her empire and transforming Russia into a naval power. In the West, she turned her eyes toward Poland. Over decades, she participated in 3 partitions that gradually erased the country from the map, each treaty carefully negotiated under the threat of Russian guns. Europe was no longer moving around Catherine. Europe was moving with her. She played the map like a chessboard, placing herself in a position that others would envy, fear, or resent. Catherine also dreamed bigger. She imagined resurrecting the fallen Byzantine Empire and placing her grandson, Constantine, on a Greek throne. It was bold, perhaps even reckless, but she refused to think in small terms. She saw empires as games of strategy, as pieces to be moved with precision and intelligence, and Russia as the most powerful piece of all. Inside her empire, she pursued another conquest: culture. Art, architecture, and knowledge became tools of power. She sent ships to Italy, France, and Holland, filling St. Petersburg with masterpieces that would later form the Hermitage. She built new palaces, expanded libraries, and created spaces where knowledge could thrive. Her empire was not only vast, but also magnificent. Yet for all her brilliance, the empire beneath her glittering court was a place of pain. Millions of serfs lived in brutal conditions, sold by landlords, beaten, starved, and worked to exhaustion. Catherine had ideals of the Enlightenment, but she understood one truth: stability required obedience, and obedience often demanded fear. When rebellion rose, she crushed it without hesitation. In 1773, Yemelyan Pugachev,
a Cossack claiming to be Peter III returned from the dead, led a rebellion that spread like wildfire across Russia. Towns fell, landlords were slaughtered, imperial authority collapsed in large regions. For the first time, Catherine saw the empire tremble beneath her. She responded swiftly, mercilessly. Pugachev was captured, paraded through Moscow in a cage, and executed publicly. His followers were hanged along roads, their bodies left as warnings. The message was clear: break Russia, and Russia will break you. Even as she ruled with intelligence and vision, her personal life became a target. Her lovers were known openly, a practice that shocked Europe. They were not merely companions, but allies, trusted men who shared ambition and helped stabilize her rule. Yet the world often ignored her political genius, focusing instead on her personal choices. A woman who ruled with her mind and enjoyed pleasure with her heart was a scandal waiting to be born. Her enemies began to whisper, plotting ways to diminish her accomplishments. It was easy to attack her personally because the truth of her power was undeniable. She could not be ignored, and for a world used to men ruling, she was dangerous simply by existing. Every victory, every conquest, every cultural achievement became a double-edged sword in the hands of her detractors. Despite this, Catherine continued to build, expand, and strengthen her empire. Her reforms transformed St. Petersburg into a city that reflected her vision, modern, enlightened, and commanding. Her armies moved like winter wind across borders. Her diplomats negotiated treaties that others thought impossible, and her court became a center of knowledge and innovation. By now, Catherine was more than an empress. She was a force of nature, a mind as sharp as any man's, a ruler as ruthless as any general, a woman whose will shaped history. And yet the more powerful she became, the more the whispers turned into rumors, the rumors into lies, and the lies into scandal. She was already a figure of history, and the world would not wait for the truth. Her rise was unstoppable, her reign inevitable, and her enemies would soon discover that nothing could crush her power, except the stories they would tell after her death. Catherine the Great understood that ruling an empire was not just about armies or treaties. It was about ideas, culture, and the heart of a nation. From the very first day she ascended the throne, she saw St. Petersburg not merely as a capital city, but as a stage, a symbol, a reflection of the empire she intended to build. Every stone, every street, every palace could speak of power, refinement, and vision, if it were guided with intelligence. The city was cold, harsh, and imposing. Its wide streets could feel empty in winter, and its buildings reflected a world of rigid formality and centuries of tradition. But Catherine had a mind for transformation. She brought in architects from France, Italy, and Germany, reshaping the skyline, erecting palaces that rivaled Versailles, constructing theaters, bridges, and monuments. St. Petersburg became a city of ideas as much as a city of stone. Catherine's vision extended far beyond mere buildings. She brought in thinkers, philosophers, and scientists to her court, creating a place where knowledge was not just studied, but celebrated. The young empress read their works voraciously, wrote letters to them, and debated with them. Voltaire, Diderot, and other European minds became her allies across the continent, defending her reputation while exchanging ideas that would shape the policies and cultural growth of Russia. Her library grew into a treasure trove of wisdom. She consumed books on philosophy, history, governance, and law, reading hundreds at a time, always seeking the knowledge that could help her govern better than anyone before. She didn't merely read to impress. She read to learn, to understand, to apply. Ideas became tools, and knowledge became power. But culture and intellect alone could not secure an empire. Catherine understood that Russia's borders were vast and vulnerable. The Ottoman Empire to the south, the fragile lands of Poland to the west, and rival powers surrounding her demanded vigilance, strategy, and decisive action. The young Empress, now fully aware of the chessboard she commanded, began to move her pieces with precision. The Black Sea was her first target. She sought control of Crimea, a region critical to naval power and trade. In 1783, after careful planning, negotiations, and military maneuvers, Crimea came under Russian control. This single act transformed Russia from a landlocked giant into a naval force capable of projecting power across Europe. For the first time, Russia was feared not just for its armies, but for its strategic dominance. Poland, fragmented and politically weak, became another stage for her ambition. Through careful diplomacy, treaties, and the threat of force, Catherine oversaw 3 partitions that slowly erased the country from the map. It was not conquest for the sake of conquest. It was strategy, the careful positioning of Russia as a power no one could ignore. She had become a ruler who reshaped the continent through intellect, strategy, and calculated action. Yet, as she expanded her borders and reshaped nations, the empire within her reach was not entirely stable. Millions of serfs lived in brutal conditions, their lives controlled by nobles who answered to Catherine only in theory. Peasants were sold, beaten, and worked to exhaustion. The idealism of Enlightenment thinking collided with the harsh realities of power, forcing Catherine to make choices that balanced reform with control. In 1773, that balance was tested. Emelian Pugachev, a Cossack claiming to be the returned Peter III, led a rebellion across Russia. Towns fell, nobles were killed, and the empire seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. Catherine responded with ruthless precision. She marshaled her armies, crushed the rebellion, and ensured that Pugachev's followers faced public executions. The message was unmistakable. Challenge Russia, and Russia will respond with absolute force. Her methods were harsh, but they secured the empire. She understood that power required more than goodwill or intelligence. It required obedience, and when necessary, fear. The paradox of her rule was clear. Enlightenment ideals guided her intellect, but the reality of empire demanded an iron fist. Amid all this, Catherine's personal life became a subject of scrutiny. Her lovers were visible, known within the court, but they were also strategic allies. Each relationship had purpose. Some provided emotional refuge, others strengthened political alliances, and some ensured loyalty from men whose ambitions could threaten her reign. Catherine did not seek scandal, but she understood that a woman of power would always be judged differently than a man. What was strategy for her could easily be twisted into impropriety by those who wished to undermine her. Yet for all the whispers and the plots, Catherine continued her work. She built the Hermitage, amassing one of the greatest collections of art in the world. She reformed government structures, modernized administration, and created laws that strengthened the central authority. She expanded education, encouraged scientific research, and promoted the arts. Every palace, every policy, every treaty was a reflection of her intelligence, her will, and her ambition. Catherine had become more than a ruler. She had become a symbol, not just of power, but of what a woman could achieve in a world that constantly sought to diminish her. She wielded armies, negotiated treaties, and expanded an empire with a precision few men could match. And yet, for all her accomplishments, the world began to focus less on her brilliance and more on her personal life. Rumors, innuendo, and whispers began to shadow her achievements. The paradox of Catherine's reign became clear. The stronger she became, the more her enemies sought to reduce her. to twist her power into scandal, to focus on her choices rather than her results. Europe could accept kings, generals, and conquerors, but a woman who ruled with intelligence, strategy, and authority was a threat too great for some to bear. And so the stories began to grow, small whispers at first, then louder, darker, more grotesque. But Catherine remained undeterred. She knew that power was built on results, not on the opinions of the envious. Every city she transformed, every border she secured, every idea she implemented became a testament to her mind and will. And while rumors would always swirl, her empire, vast, sophisticated, and unyielding, stood as a monument to her genius. Through intellect, strategy, and relentless determination, Catherine the Great had not only seized power, she had reshaped it. Russia was no longer merely a kingdom, it was an empire in her image, commanding respect, awe, and fear across the continent. And yet for all the glory, for all the victories, the whispers of scandal were already taking root, waiting for the day they would overshadow even this remarkable reality. Catherine had built an empire, but the world was preparing to build a story that could nearly destroy her legacy.
No empire is built without resistance. No throne is seized without opposition. For Catherine the Great, the challenges of ruling Russia were never limited to borders or foreign rivals. They began within, in the very heart of her empire. The vast lands of Russia were home to millions of serfs, thousands of nobles, and countless soldiers. Each group had its own ambitions, grievances, and dangers. And among them, the seeds of rebellion were always waiting for the right moment to grow. In 1773, that moment came in the form of Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack with charisma and cunning. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's late husband, returned from the dead. The claim was false, yet it ignited a spark among the oppressed. Peasants and disillusioned soldiers, suffering under harsh landlords and feudal laws, saw in Pugachev a figure who promised liberation and vengeance. Towns rose in revolt, governors were overthrown, and chaos spread across the southern territories. Catherine, informed of the rebellion, understood its magnitude immediately. This was not a minor skirmish or a localized revolt. It was an existential threat to her rule. The empire itself trembled under the weight of unrest. Yet she did not panic. Panic was for the weak. Catherine's response was calculated, ruthless, and precise. She marshaled her forces, directing her generals to act with discipline and efficiency. Every town reclaimed, every rebel captured, every threat neutralized would send a message that Russia was not to be challenged. Pugachev's army was formidable, bolstered by peasants desperate for change. Towns fell like dominoes, landlords were slaughtered, local officials fled or were executed. The rebellion threatened to destabilize the empire in a way Catherine had not faced since ascending the throne. But she remained unmoved in her determination to restore order. The young empress who had endured humiliation, insult, and danger had now become the sovereign capable of wielding power on a scale that few rulers could imagine. Catherine understood the psychology of fear. To restore obedience, she needed not just victory, but a demonstration of authority that would echo across the empire. Pugachev was captured, paraded through Moscow in a cage, and executed publicly. His followers met similar fates, hanged along the roads, their bodies left as warnings. The punishment was harsh, but Catherine knew it had to be. The empire demanded discipline, and rebellion could not be tolerated. Her message was unmistakable. Challenge Russia, and Russia will respond with absolute force. The rebellion left an indelible mark on Catherine's rule. It forced her to confront the stark realities of governance. Enlightenment ideals, justice, reform, progress were tempered by the demands of survival and stability.
She strengthened the authority of the nobility, allowing them greater control over their peasants to maintain order. The paradox of her reign became clear. Intellectual and cultural advancement on the surface, iron and fear beneath. Yet her actions were not born of cruelty alone. She was pragmatic. The survival of her empire depended on obedience, and obedience often required calculated ruthlessness. She understood that a ruler who hesitated in moments of crisis would not survive in Russia, where loyalty was fragile and ambition was everywhere. Every execution, every crackdown, every act of punishment was a strategic decision aimed at preserving the empire and her power. The rebellion also revealed Catherine's intelligence in governance. She reorganized administration, improved communication between the central government and distant provinces, and strengthened the military to respond quickly to future threats. She learned from every failure, adapted her strategies, and ensured that the empire would not be as vulnerable again. Each action, while harsh, contributed to the long-term stability of Russia. Catherine's handling of the rebellion also highlighted her political acumen. She balanced fear with loyalty, ensuring that those who remained faithful to the crown were rewarded and protected. Nobles who had questioned her rule were reminded of the consequences of disloyalty, while allies who supported her during the crisis were elevated, given land, titles, and influence. Her ability to manipulate power, reward loyalty, and punish dissent cemented her authority across Russia. Despite the chaos, Catherine's personal resolve remained unshaken. She had endured humiliation as a young bride, survived the failures of her husband, and outmaneuvered rivals to seize the throne. A rebellion, no matter how widespread, was just another challenge to overcome. It tested her skill, her intelligence, and her ruthlessness, but it did not define her. She defined it. The aftermath of the rebellion had lasting consequences. While the empire became more stable, the lives of millions of peasants grew harsher under the tightened control of nobles. Enlightenment ideals were often compromised in favor of political expediency. Catherine's pragmatism, however, ensured the survival and expansion of the empire. She learned to wield fear as skillfully as intellect, and to balance mercy with severity. The rebellion had tested her, but it had also proven her capabilities as a ruler, capable of commanding one of the largest and most complex empires in the world. Even as she rebuilt the empire from the chaos, whispers began to circulate beyond her borders. Europe watched the events unfold with a mixture of fascination, envy, and horror. Catherine's decisiveness, intelligence, and ruthlessness drew admiration from some and fear from others. But as her power grew, so did the desire to reduce her achievements, to twist her strength into scandal, and to tarnish the legacy of the woman who had outmaneuvered every adversary. Catherine knew that ruling Russia required more than armies, laws, or treaties. It required perception. She understood that stories, rumors, and the opinions of her people and foreign courts could shape her legacy as much as her deeds. The Pugachev rebellion was both a test of her skill and the demonstration to the world. Catherine the Great was not to be underestimated. She could endure, she could adapt, and she could destroy those who dared to oppose her. In the years that followed, Catherine would face other challenges: internal strife, foreign conflicts, and political intrigue, but none would shake her the way the rebellion had. Instead, it reinforced her understanding of power, of strategy, and of the delicate balance between fear and respect. Her ability to survive and prevail against such odds would become a defining characteristic of her reign. The empire was now secured, the rebellion crushed, and Catherine's authority undisputed. She had survived fire and blood, proving that she was not only a ruler, but a force capable of shaping history. Every city rebuilt, every law enforced, every enemy defeated, became part of the narrative of her greatness. And yet, as Russia stabilized under her rule, the world beyond its borders was beginning to craft a story that would shadow even her remarkable achievements. The whispers that had started during the rebellion would grow, mutate, and eventually become a legend that sought to diminish the power, intelligence, and legacy of the woman who had ruled with unmatched brilliance.
Catherine had conquered armies, suppressed rebellion, and expanded her empire. But the most insidious challenge, the one of perception and legacy, was only just beginning to take shape.
Catherine the Great's brilliance was undeniable, her power unchallenged, her empire vast. Yet even as she shaped Russia into a force feared and respected across Europe, another battlefield emerged, one that required no army, no treaty, no strategy. The battlefield of perception. For a woman who ruled with intelligence, ambition, and authority, society had no category. And when society could not define her, it created stories instead. From the earliest days of her reign, Catherine's personal life drew attention. Her lovers were not hidden in shadows. They were visible, known, and sometimes necessary. These men were often loyal allies, intelligent companions, and strategic partners. They were chosen carefully, nurtured, and when their purpose was fulfilled, released with rewards rather than punishment. Where kings had discarded mistresses as easily as broken toys, Catherine ensured hers left with wealth, respect, and security. Her relationships, however, were never judged for their practicality. They were judged for their audacity. Europe had long tolerated male rulers with mistresses, concubines, and secret affairs. It had not tolerated a woman who dared to take lovers with the same freedom and strategic intention. Catherine's enemies seized upon her choices, twisting them into tales of debauchery, lust, and moral decay. Every personal decision was transformed into public judgment. Every intimate relationship became a weapon for those who wanted to diminish her. Among her most famous lovers was Grigory Orlov, a soldier who played a pivotal role in her rise to power. Their bond was as much political as it was personal. He helped her orchestrate the removal of Peter III and secured her position as Empress. Though their romantic relationship eventually ended, Orlov remained a loyal supporter, a testament to Catherine's ability to intertwine personal relationships with political strategy. Then came Grigory Potemkin, a man of vision and power. Their connection was extraordinary, blending romance with governments. Potemkin advised her on military campaigns, governed territories, and helped consolidate her empire. Together they were a force that extended far beyond the bounds of intimacy. Even after their romantic partnership faded, their political partnership endured. Potemkin's influence on the empire would last decades, and his loyalty underscored Catherine's ability to turn personal ties into lasting instruments of government. Later favorites were often younger, ornamental, and politically less significant, yet Catherine treated each relationship with care. She ensured her lovers were supported, protected, and elevated when appropriate. In doing so, she reinforced a central truth. Intimacy could be wielded without weakening authority. And yet for outsiders, especially those who envied her power, these relationships were evidence of a deeper moral flaw. The whispers began quietly in the salons of Paris, Vienna, and London. Diplomats, exiled nobles, and rival monarchs shared tales of the Empress's supposed excesses. They painted her as reckless, insatiable, and unrestrained, ignoring her intelligence, her reforms, her victories, and her strategic mind. A woman who ruled an empire was already extraordinary. A woman who enjoyed life, love, and power without apology became dangerous. As years passed, the whispers grew into rumors. Her personal life, once a practical instrument of statecraft, was recast as scandal. Stories mutated with each retelling, exaggerated by imagination, hatred, or fear. What began as gossip became legend, and what started in private halls spread to the streets and salons of Europe. The tales were grotesque, vivid, and memorable, precisely the qualities that allowed them to overshadow reality. The most infamous of these tales concerned the circumstances of her death. Though she died quietly, as all mortals do, rumors would later claim that her end was not natural. The tales were absurd, biologically impossible, and physically implausible, yet they were irresistible. Europe, unable to comprehend a woman who could conquer, rule, and outmaneuver any man, chose to believe in scandal rather than genius. The myths reduced Catherine the Great to a grotesque caricature, stripping away the accomplishments that had truly defined her reign. Catherine had lived as a ruler in a world that could not tolerate a woman of her abilities. She had conquered armies, reshaped borders, expanded empires, and transformed culture. And yet, despite all this, the court of public opinion often sought to diminish her with whispers, exaggerations, and lies. The scandalous stories were not accidental. They were tools, carefully constructed by those who could not challenge her victories, but wanted to destroy her memory. As the rumors grew, Catherine did not waver in her rule. She continued to govern, expand, and innovate. She corresponded with European philosophers, implemented reforms, and strengthened the empire's infrastructure. Her vision for Russia remained unshaken, guided by intellect, strategy, and relentless ambition. She understood that power was never secure, that perception could be as dangerous as an invading army, and that control over one's legacy was as critical as control over one's borders. In many ways, the scandal of Catherine's life and the myths surrounding her death were a testament to her power. They revealed the fear she inspired. If people had accepted her merely as brilliant, Europe would not have needed lies to reduce her. If they had comprehended her intellect and authority, they would have had no other choice than to respect her. The tales of scandal were evidence that Catherine had broken every expectation placed upon a woman, a monarch, and a human being of ambition. Through all of this, Catherine remained formidable. She understood the paradox. The more extraordinary a woman, the more the world seeks to diminish her. She embraced her contradictions. She wielded her intellect and will as deftly as any weapon. Every whisper, every rumor, every attempt to tarnish her legacy became part of the challenge she had learned to master. By the time of her death in 1796, Catherine's empire was secure, vast, and thriving. Yet the stories of scandal, lies, and rumor had already begun their long, persistent march across Europe. The myths she left behind would not define her power. They would attempt to erase it, but history would ultimately remember the truth. Beneath the whispers, beneath the grotesque tales, the real Catherine the Great had ruled with unmatched brilliance, reshaping the largest empire in Europe with intellect, ambition, and courage. She had survived humiliation, rebellion, and betrayal. She had conquered armies, reshaped nations, and transformed culture. And even as the world whispered against her, she had done what few rulers, male or female, had ever done. She had written her own story, in power, in vision, and in legacy.
The year was 1796. November had wrapped St. Petersburg in a thick, icy silence. The Winter Palace, grand and imposing, stood like a frozen sentinel over the city, its gilded halls echoing centuries of power, betrayal, and ambition. And within it, Catherine the Great, The woman who had ruled an empire with unmatched brilliance and ruthlessness lay in the quiet moments before death. Her final hours were not violent or scandalous, despite what history would later imagine. On a cold morning, Catherine had collapsed in her private bathroom. It was sudden, a stroke or a fainting spell. Her body failed quietly, without fanfare. Servants rushed to her side, lifting her into her massive imperial bed beneath the towering velvet canopy that seemed to touch the ceiling. Candle flames flickered, shadows danced on the gilded walls, and doctors gathered with grave faces. They documented every detail, the timing, the symptoms, the fading pulse. The events were ordinary, inevitable, and human. And yet, almost immediately, stories began to spread. The world had long struggled with women who wielded power like men. Catherine's intelligence, ambition, and authority had terrified her enemies during her life. Now, in death, they sought to reduce her to something grotesque, obscene, and unforgettable. The whispers began quietly in salons, taverns, and courts. Did she die as all women should? Or had her desires led her to a fatal indulgence? The most infamous of these rumors was absurd, impossible, yet it spread like wildfire. Catherine, they said, had died under the most humiliating and grotesque circumstances involving a horse. The details mutated with every retelling: a pulley, a suspended stallion, a snapped harness, a crushed Empress. Biologically impossible, logically absurd, but memorable, unforgettable, sensational. Europe could not comprehend a woman who seized an empire, commanded armies, and outmaneuvered kings without assigning some grotesque punishment for her audacity. The rumor spread across borders faster than the truth could ever travel. It leapt from court to court, from salon to tavern, whispered by diplomats, exiled nobles, and bitter rivals. It reached Paris, London, Vienna, and Berlin. And each time it was retold, it grew, shaped by fear, envy, and imagination. Catherine's accomplishments, her wars, her treaties, her reforms, her expansion of Russian power, faded behind the lurid tale. People no longer saw the woman who had transformed nations. They saw a caricature, a figure of ridicule and moral judgment. Her son, Paul, now ascended to the throne, did nothing to defend her reputation. Their relationship had long been strained. Suspicion, resentment, and a sense of stolen inheritance poisoned their bond. Paul had every reason to silence the rumors, but chose not to. Perhaps he believed them. Perhaps he simply wished to step out from under the shadow of his mother's power. Either way, the silence allowed the scandal to flourish unchecked. Yet even as the myths grew, the truth remained. Catherine's life was extraordinary, not for scandal, but for power, intellect, and achievement. She had survived humiliation, political danger, and rebellion. She had expanded an empire, transformed culture, and secured her nation's place in Europe. She had ruled decisively, with intelligence, strategy, and courage, bending nations and people to her will. The lies of her death were not a reflection of her life. They were a reflection of society's inability to comprehend it. The grotesque stories of Catherine's death were in many ways a punishment devised long before her final hour. Society had long resisted the idea of a woman who could rule without apology. It had accepted tyrants, conquerors, and rulers with brutality as long as they were men. But a woman who could master armies, diplomacy, and culture? That was unacceptable. And so the tale was constructed, not as history, but as vengeance. The rumor became legend. By the early 1800s, it was whispered in every corner of Europe. By the mid-19th century, it was recorded in books, repeated in travelogues, and immortalized in caricatures. Even the educated repeated it casually, as if it were a historical footnote rather than the weaponized lie it was. But beneath the myth, the real Catherine remained intact. Her empire, her reforms, her strategies, and her intellect were unassailable. The scandal, as grotesque as it was, could not erase her legacy. It could not diminish the reality of her accomplishments. Catherine had been a ruler in every sense of the word. She had expanded borders, strengthened the state, and built an empire capable of influencing the entire continent. She had transformed culture, promoted science and philosophy, and shaped the identity of a nation. The myth was loud, but history remembered. And there lies the lesson of Catherine's life and death. The world may try to flatten extraordinary individuals into something simple, obscene, or laughable. Scandal travels faster than truth, and stories often stick where reality cannot. Yet power, intellect, and achievement endure beyond rumor. Catherine the Great was never simple. She was real, complex, brilliant, ruthless, compassionate, ambitious, and human. And no matter how many myths were created to diminish her, history cannot erase the truth of who she was. Her death, while peaceful and ordinary in reality, became a symbol of the challenges she faced as a powerful woman. The lies of the world could attempt to crush her memory, but they could not destroy the empire she had built, the culture she had shaped, and the legacy she had earned. Catherine's story endured, teaching a lesson about ambition, intelligence, and the dangers of underestimating those who dared to defy expectations. Even centuries later, when people repeat the myths, they unknowingly highlight the very reason Catherine was feared and envied in her lifetime. She had broken barriers, mastered power, and challenged the norms of her society. And in that, she remains untouchable. The stories, as scandalous as they are, only exist because she once existed as more than anyone expected a woman could be. Catherine the Great died in her bed, surrounded by servants and doctors, leaving the world an empire stronger than any it had ever known. The myths of her death could distort her image, but they could never diminish her reality. She remains, in history and in memory, a ruler whose intelligence, ambition, and courage reshaped nations, defied expectations, and created a legacy far greater than any rumor could contain.